Now, UNICEF says African governments are not spending enough to ensure quality education for children. Most of the countries are failing to meet the commitments to allocate 20% of their national budgets on education. Let's unpack this story. Polycarp Otieno is UNICEF's education specialist. He joins us this afternoon for a sense of how this can be, Polycarp, in a context where we struggle on so many African countries with issues like unemployment numbers. Here in South Africa alone, 45% of young people are sitting at home without a job. So when we talk about the African countries that are not sticking to this 20% commitment, who is on that list?
Thank you very much, Michelle, for having me this afternoon. First of all, I would like to mention that indeed it's true that African governments are not spending enough on education. The report that you just released shows that collectively African governments spent about 15% of their education resources on education. So to your question on which countries are not spending the 20% on education, so we have countries like Angola, Central African Republic, Seychelles, Somalia, South Sudan, and Uganda that are not spending less than 10% of the government budgets on education. Remember, in 2015, at the turn of the SDG Sustainable Development Goals, countries committed themselves to spend at least 15 to 20% of their government budgets to education. So those are some of the countries that we're seeing that are not spending the commitment that they made. Thank you.
It's interesting because what your research tells us is that African governments are boosting enrollment, or they have boosted enrollment in primary and secondary school over the past 10 years, right? But funding remains an issue. Even though more kids are actually in a classroom, they don't have the necessary equipment to make use of that time.
That is essentially true, and that is why in the learning poverty results that we have that 4 in 5 children in Africa are not learning. They're not reading, they're not able to read a simple text for understanding, and critically because they are not having sufficient equipment, sufficient materials, sufficient classrooms, or sufficient trained teachers to be able to translate their presence in school into learning. And that is part of the call that we are making, that if we are to improve the learning poverty that we have in the continent, then we have to not only increase the investment that we have in education, but also invest right. Ensure that we are having much more trained teachers, ensuring that we are able to support teachers so that they can support learners to translate the time that they have in school to learning. I would give you an example of Kenya, for instance. You have that the average year spent in school by a child is 11 years. But if you look at how much they learn, that reduces their adjusted learning years to about 8. It means that 3 years of the children's presence in school do not count, essentially.
Yeah, that is absolutely shocking. How do you also balance out the kind of investment in tertiary education versus the seeming lack of investment in pre-primary education? That foundation phase is obviously something that lays the foundation, like you talked about, the number of children who are unable to read by the age of 10. 4 out of 5, I think you said, children aged 10 years old, unable to read and understand a simple story. That lack of investment in the foundation phase of schooling must surely also be an issue on the continent.
Certainly, Michelle, the continent is spending about 2% of education budget in pre-primary education, and this is against the 10% commitment that was made in Tashkent in 2022. So governments are encouraged to spend about 10% of their education expenditure dedicated to pre-primary education. Essentially, this is because 85% of child development happens between 3 to 6. So if you delay investment on a child beyond this age, then you lose out on the efficiencies that would have built in this child. So when you have African countries spending 20% of their education budget on tertiary education, it's not that we do not love tertiary education, but you end up only benefiting a few. So that's why we are saying, can we spend at the early stages of learning, then you improve the chances of a child not dropping out or repeating, because when they repeat, then you have to reinvest double. And if you invest in early years, again, we have a wealth of evidence that says that you improve their future earnings. You also avoid future costs that you are going to incur in areas, other social areas like health and so on and so forth. So we are calling on governments to be able to reprioritize early years instead of over prioritizing tertiary education.
Loud and clear. Let me thank you for your time. Polycarp Otieno is an education specialist with UNICEF. We're talking about African governments not spending what they need to ensure quality education for children in their countries.